tell me right now!
I was able to cover my favorite movie of all time in the first episode with The Thing, and now we're going to look at an adaptation, or three, of my favorite story of all time. While you may not know the work of Richard Matheson by name, I guarantee you know the work and the artist from somewhere. He's one of the most successful writers both on screen and off of the 20th century, and many of his works have been adapted multiple times over. Today's movie, while having 2 adaptations already in the books, was in development hell for what felt like forever, but would eventually be a blockbuster that did better than anyone expected. Today we look at the 2007 adaptation of I Am Legend. Grab your anti-vampire kit and try not to get too lonely as we look at what happened to I Am Legend.
My name is Robert Neville. I'm a survivor living in New York City. I am broadcasting on all AM frequencies. If there's anybody out there, anybody, please.
I Am Legend was the long-in-production, horror, sci-fi, loneliness simulator that would eventually come out in 2007. One of the more famous iterations being worked on was the adaptation starring Arnold Schwarzenegger and being directed by Ridley Scott. The original script was written by Mark Protosevich after studio execs were impressed by his work on the Jennifer Lopez horror movie The Cell. Tom Cruise, Michael Douglas, and Mel Gibson were all considered before the studio finally decided they wanted Arnold in the main role. Scott would replace Protosevich with 2 different screenwriters, but eventually Warner Brothers would reinstate him after they didn't like where the project was going. The project as is would be effectively cancelled due to both budget concerns and the perceived failure of recent Arnold and Scott movies.
Fuck you, asshole.
It was resurrected again, this time with Arnold in a producer's role and Will Smith and Michael Bay attached to star and direct respectively, but eventually it went to Francis Lawrence. Lawrence had directed many a music video before helming dark superhero movie Constantine with Keanu Reeves, and he would go on to direct other movies like Water for Elephants, 3 of the Hunger Games movies, and infamous Jennifer Lawrence flop Red Sparrow. The final script would be written by Oscar winner Akiva Goldsman, with a credit given to Protosevich for the previous work. Will Smith and Alice Braga would be the main human actors for the movie. Smith, controversies and all, needs no introduction, and this may be the closest thing to horror he's ever done. Obviously, other sci-fi movies like Independence Day, I, Robot, and the Men in Black movies have been very successful, but this is the darkest of his entries into the genre. Alice Braga is a highly regarded actress who also appeared in the horror movies The Right and Blindness, with a main credit in Predators from 2010. The movie was released on December 14, 2007 to pretty good reviews and a gross $585 million on its $150 million budget. While Richard Matheson is probably best known for today's work, his career spanned nearly 6 decades, and his list of accomplishments and adaptations is, if you'll forgive me, legendary. He was born in 1926 and lived all the way until 2013, with his stories still being adapted at the time of his death. I Am Legend alone has been adapted into 3 separate films, with The Last Man on Earth, The Omega Man, and I Am Legend. Other famous novel adaptations of his include Stir of Echoes, Legend of Hell House, and What Dreams May Come. He worked with Roger Corman in adapting Poe stories with Vincent Price, had many short stories turned into Twilight Zone episodes, and even wrote a couple films for the famed Hammer Studios. He would give Steven Spielberg one of his earliest films with a duel, and I'd be upset at myself if I didn't mention his role writing for Kolchak the Night Stalker, specifically the 2 TV movies that led into the show. I Am Legend as a work of fiction was received incredibly well. The writing, characterizations, and themes were all raved about, while the depiction of vampires was new and fresh. His early writings were inspired by 1931's Dracula, so it's no surprise he gave vampires a go. The first movie adaptation was in 1964 with Vincent Price leading as The Last Man on Earth, with the script being co-written by Matheson himself. That iteration has become something of a cult classic and is relatively faithful to its source material. In fact, his vampires look more like the eventual slow-moving zombies of Romero's Night of the Living Dead later that decade. The second adaptation is The Omega Man, starring Charlton Heston as part of his science fiction trilogy along with Soylent Green and Planet of the Apes. Omega Man is very much of its time in 1971, but has a lot of good things to say and show on screen, even if it takes more liberties with the source material than the first adaptation. I Am Legend, the movie not the book, is currently set to get a sequel starring Smith and Michael B. Jordan. Both mediums follow Robert Neville, who fears he's the last man on Earth after a worldwide catastrophe that has a slow build at first, but then comes crashing down fast. He lost his wife and daughter due to this event, and has been dealing with the aftermath where most of the population has died, and he's the last fully human survivor. By last fully human, I mean due to the vampire-like creatures that exist in the world. Neville suffers from extreme depression and isolation while scavenging for supplies and also mapping where in the city the remaining vampires are staying. He's devastated by the death of the dog, who he fears would be his only companion, and experiments on the vampire-like creatures. After 3 years, Neville finds a woman and tries to help her because he's immune to the virus that has spread across humanity. Depending on which ending you get, they're either the same thematically, where Neville realizes he is the legend, or Neville dies, but not both. The vampires aren't necessarily traditional vampires in both mediums, and they do a great job with the feeling of loneliness and isolation. Let's start with the little things first. The movie takes place in New York while the story takes place in Los Angeles. Robert Neville in the movie is a scientist that had a direct connection with the virus, where in the book he decides to research what may have happened, and the virus was only a part of the world ending. There was also a mass-scale war and other issues that happened. In the movie, Robert's wife and daughter die in a terrible helicopter accident, where the novel has us watch the virus take them both, and later, after he buries his wife, she comes back to the house. Timeline-wise, the book was written in 1954, but the events take place in 1976, while there's only a 5-year difference between the 2007 release of the film and its 2012 setting. With that out of the way, it's time to look at some of the bigger changes. The first major one is how the vampires, or Darkseekers as the movie calls them, are treated. The vampires in the book seem a lot like what the stories tell us about them. They die in direct sunlight, will perish with a good stake through the heart, and are averse to garlic. They are pale in skin, drink blood, and are seemingly immune to the bullets from Neville's gun. In reality, Neville finds out that it's a bacterium that creates the appearance of being a vampire. The stake creates a large enough hole that the host is destroyed, whereas his bullets are too small and weak, so the bacteria is able to close the wounds up again. He later determines that their fear of garlic and mirrors is due to a sort of hysterical blindness where they believe they are vampires. Finally, at some point there are 2 different groups discovered. A feral kind of group that are reanimated bodies of deceased people, and then there's the more civilized group that can talk and function, almost live with the disease. He has a neighbor named Ben who calls out to him and taunts him at night. The movie vampires are all more on the feral side, even when the alpha is able to emote more in the director's cut ending. There's never a mention of the word vampire, and Neville's bullets and guns work just fine in addition to the sunlight. He is much more interested in finding a cure in the movie rather than just eradication, but he's killed many of them. The next major difference is how he interacts with other characters. The dog in the movie is named Samantha and has been his companion since the start of the pandemic. While it's undoubtedly the saddest part of the movie, hell, I'm a parent and I still get more sad about the dog than his wife and kid, the book is devastating. He spends a good chunk of time just trying to gain the dog's trust and take care of it and run tests. He's so lonely, and then there's just a simple line about the dog being dead within a week. It's honestly one of the hardest things I've ever had to read. The woman he meets is traveling with her son in the movie, and she saves him after he goes suicidal post-doggy death. She's a good person and just wants to help both her son and Neville. The woman in the book is actually a spy for the more civilized group of vampires, many of whom he has killed. She starts to have feelings for him even after admitting that he killed her husband, and attempts to warn him of her group coming to capture him. At the end, she even assists in his death being much less gruesome than it could be. Finally, there's that ending. The ending in the book is one of the great endings ever put to paper. Neville is awaiting his death and looks out to see all the scared vampires and realizes that they aren't the legends like he believes them to be, but rather he is some mythical monster that has killed many of their ranks, and he will end up being a legend long after he dies, in a similar vein that vampires were to society. The movie misses this completely. Well, in the theatrical cut at least. The ending we saw in theaters shows Neville blowing himself up with a large group of the creatures after he gives his blood to the woman and her son to escape. In the director's cut at least, while not nearly as impactful as the book, Robert recognizes the fact that he's killed so many of theirs and even apologizes to them. Better, but not great. I Am Legend the movie is a very entertaining and well-made adaptation of the book. My personal preference of the 3 is the Omega Man, but that has a lot to do with when I saw it as a kid. I Am Legend made a ton of money and is getting a somewhat late-in-the-day sequel on the books, so it's hard to deny its fame. That being said, Matheson's novel is one that everyone, writer or not, should read and appreciate. While the movie is objectively good, the novel is seen as one of the all-time greats, something a movie will never be known as. Set aside a day or two to read the book and watch the 3 movies. Let us know in the comments which is your favorite and keep those stakes handy, just in case.